We present extracts of Cottoning On, written by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks.
My name is Nigel Banks. I'm a retired schoolteacher, living at present in Ramsgate, Kent. But I was born in Bolton, in the county of Lancashire, although it is now classed as being in the metropolitan area of Greater Manchester. My father Geoffrey was also a teacher, as was his father before him, as were my great-aunt Nora, my aunt Sheila, and my mother, so it obviously runs in the family. My main leisure time interest for over 35 years has been the theatre, either as a spectator or a participant. I've acted in and directed many productions, as well as, more recently, writing my own original plays. The drama Bug was another thing I caught from my parents, although it took a while for the symptoms to manifest themselves. Like many adolescents, I wanted to walk a million miles away from what my parents were doing. But eventually, in my early 20s, the genes came out, and I began treading the boards myself. My father had been infected at a much earlier age, taking part in school productions, and then when he was a student up at Cambridge. He met my mother on stage, in fact. It was just after the war, and they'd both been demobbed. My dad from serving in the Fleet Air Arm, and my mum from working in the Admiralty in Bath. She'd gone to Cambridge to do her teacher training year there, and my dad had returned to resume his degree in French and German, which had been interrupted when he received his call-up papers in 1942. They married in 1948 and settled back in my dad's hometown of Bolton, because he'd been offered a teaching post at his old school and decided to return to familiar territory. It was not a destination which particularly pleased my mother, who'd been spoiled by the architectural and cultural splendours of Bath and Cambridge. To be faced with the harsh realities and dark satanic mills of an industrial town in Lancashire was not what she had bargained on. It would be another 30 years before she would escape to more pleasant pastures, when my parents retired to the market town of Kendal in Cumbria. So my father began his teaching career at Bolton School and indulged his thespian tendencies by performing at the town's little theatre, where he soon became a leading light. It wasn't enough for him, however. He nursed secret ambitions to be a fully professional actor, but with a young wife and potentially a family to support, he considered it too much of a risk, given the notoriously insecure nature of the profession. Fortunately for him, an attractive compromise was awaiting him. Thanks to a chance suggestion by a sympathetic doctor, he applied for an audition with the radio drama department of the BBC in Manchester. He duly passed, and so for the next 30 years he was able to pursue a parallel career as a broadcaster. At weekends and during school holidays, we became used to him disappearing off to studios in Manchester and Leeds to record plays, read short stories, and provide the narrator's voice in features and radio documentaries. He even acted as a relief newsreader for the North West Regional News on occasion, which required him to travel to Manchester in the evening, kip down on a camp bed at the studios, and then be up at 5 in the morning to read the news bulletins, before jumping in his car to drive back to Bolton in time for his first lesson of the morning at school. He also provided one of the voices which read out extracts from the week's newspapers in the long-running review programme What the Papers Say on Granada TV. Then, just before his 60th birthday, he retired greatly from teaching and was finally able to realise his ambition of becoming a fully legit actor. He subsequently enjoyed a second 20-year career, performing in theatres all over the north of England, from Keswick to Lancaster, Chester to Scarborough, with engagements in Manchester, Leeds and York along the way. He ventured further south, appearing in Derby, Cheltenham and Colchester. He only managed one appearance on a stage in London, which was at the Greenwich Theatre, in the stage adaptation of Harper Lee's classic novel To Kill a Mockingbird. He also made many TV appearances in everything from soap operas such as Coronation Street and Emmerdale to long-running drama series like Heartbeat, Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. Even though he passed away in 2008, I still receive repeat fees for him from unlikely places like Sweden or Japan, where these programs have been shown. Although he was in regular demand, there were the inevitable periods when he was resting, to use the actor's euphemism for unemployment. It was during one of these more extended periods that he conceived the idea of writing his memoirs. I think it was not only to give himself a project with which to occupy himself, but also because there had been a spate of published memoirs or autobiographies at the time which had been very successful commercially. The leading example was Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, which was subsequently turned into a feature film starring Robert Carlyle. There were others which had a northern setting, and I think my dad felt that he had just as interesting a story to tell, and he was sufficiently self-confident to think that his prose style was superior. So he set to with a will, and wrote chapter after chapter in his spidery longhand. He then employed an acquaintance who had the necessary keyboard skills to produce a proper word-processed manuscript, extracts from which he duly sent off to various publishers, in the hope that Cottoning On, as he decided to entitle his opus, would become the next non-fiction bestseller. Alas, he had clearly missed that particular commercial boat, and the rejection slips began to mount up. Nothing daunted, he began a second volume, and also made use of an old BBC colleague who owned a small studio. He had cunningly written sections of his memoirs to last about 15 minutes, so that they could be recorded and, as he hoped, broadcast by his beloved BBC. Again, his hopes were dashed, and I think he lost heart at that stage, as he never completed the writing of the second volume. After his death, I found umpteen copies of the first volume of his memoirs, as well as the cassette tapes of him reading them, which were never broadcast. It was suggested to me that some selected extracts from his memoirs would make for an interesting insight into the life and times of someone who had a full and varied career. Naturally, I'm biased because he was my father, but I know from the glowing tributes that were paid to him at his funeral by both fellow actors and former pupils that he was exceptionally talented, and I'm both pleased and proud to be able to bring his writings to a wider audience. A few words of explanation about the significance of the title Cottoning On, which my father chose as the title for his memoirs, might be useful here. His hometown of Bolton's principal industry up until the 1960s was the spinning of cotton. Eventually, the influx of cheap foreign imports put paid to the textile industry in Lancashire, and the mill buildings were either demolished or converted for other uses. Some of them have become des-res apartment blocks for young, upwardly mobile Boltonians, I believe. But during my dad's formative years, the local landscape was dominated by the factory buildings, mill chimneys and lodges. If you peered through a grimy window in a mill, as I sometimes did myself on my way to school, you would see row upon row of spinning machines being tended by the mill hands, most of whom were women, because their fingers were more dexterous at threading the yarn onto the spindles, or cottoning it on. The phrase had a specific technical meaning originally, but as is often the case, it took on an idiomatic connotation and has come to mean the grasping of an idea, the realization of the significance of something, or to put it bluntly, the penny dropping. So I think my dad felt that it was a very appropriate phrase for his own gradual coming to terms with life as he grew up, and eventually put away childish things. In the first episode of his memoirs, we hear about my dad's entry into the world in 1921, life in Bolton at the time, and the first glimmerings of his compulsion to perform. When I was a child in Bolton in the 1920s, I was brought up to believe it was the biggest cotton town in the world. Quite possibly this was inaccurate. I was fed some ropey information in my early years, and being an uninquiring sort of lad, I never felt the need to check it out. Bolton certainly was big in terms of its principal industry, but it was pretty small town too in other ways. One of its sons returned home to become editor of the local newspaper, after great success in London and the wider world. He was deeply attached to the place, but from time to time would sigh over its parochialism. By way of illustration, he once showed me a carefully preserved cutting from an earlier edition of his newspaper, which referred to an accident at the Grand, our local palace of varieties, a novelty dancer had tripped over the footlights and fallen into the front row of the stalls. He fractured both his legs so badly that it was feared he would never dance again. But the headline in the evening news proclaimed, "Bolton audience fallen into." The town wasn't only parochial, it was damp. Those who complain about the annual rainfall in Cumbria are reminded reasonably enough that there cannot be a lake district without water. Neither could Lancashire be the centre of the cotton industry without sufficient moisture in the air to stop the threads from snapping, I was told. In addition, the place was mucky. Today, on Victoria Square, the only buildings which remain from my boyhood are the old library and the town hall. Their stonework has the same pale colour now as the much more recent buildings which surround them. But I grew up to accept that they were black, as were the market hall, the parish church, Holy Trinity, and every other stone construction in the town. I grew up to accept that cart horses had to scramble for a foothold on cobblestones made treacherous by the drizzle and the grime, and would sometimes fall, and that those which fell conveniently, so to speak, would get a restorative drink from one of the stone horse troughs which stood at certain roadsides, and which were also black. I grew up in the knowledge that cart horses took in a lot of water anyway, like the steam locomotives which pulled the trains. The faces of the men who drove the trains were black, until they went home and washed them white, that is. I grew up believing that if I didn't keep the front wheel of my bike out of the grooves in the tram lines, I'd have to pedal all the way to the tram shed to get released. Lastly, I grew up resigned to the fact that Grandpa Tomlins, if he wished, could squash any of my questions which began with, "Why?" by saying categorically, "Because the trams pass the market." I grew up unaware of the fact that he said this when he didn't know the answer. When I came back home after the Second World War, Bolton was just as damp and grimy. There were more buses and fewer horses on the streets, but trams still ran on certain routes, and overall the scene was much the same. In 1947, my fiancée paid her first visit to the town on a typically bleak March day. She arrived by bus from the Manchester direction, a non-scenic route to say the least. Still, after a childhood spent in Glasgow, she knew what to expect. The young newlywed French girl from Paris who arrived in Bolton that year and later became our friend did not. She confided that her husband had tried to warn her, but that, "Mon Dieu, it was worse." But on the other hand, if you went up towards the moors on the northern outskirts during Wakes Week, not a single mill chimney would be operating. The air you breathed was just like wine. A cotton town needed understanding, that's all. And you had to be selective. I found Bolton to be a town for most seasons. It was 60 years before I was settled somewhere else. My editor friends said each time I revealed another instance of my naivety, "You may be a Cambridge scholar, but good grief, you're a late developer." However lengthy that process was to prove, it began on the 5th of August 1921, when my father ran to fetch the doctor. He had to run across a field or two, because the home where I was to be born was a farm worker's cottage, in the minute hamlet of Dimple, beyond the town boundary, a mile or two to the north. I have no memories of that first home, because we moved while I was still a pram case, to a small terraced house on the town boundary. It was a move of only a mile or so, but it brought my father conveniently nearer to his work. I don't remember that second home either. I wasn't taking in very much at the time. In fact, if I'd not been told about it later, I would have known nothing of my one brief escapade. It appears that, as I lay outside the house in the bright winter sunshine, an entire roofful of snow descended on the pram and obliterated me from view. It was reported with awe by the passer-by who dug me out that I bore the experience with magisterial calm. This may not be said of my later brushes with fate. The pram in which I survived the great avalanche of 1922 clocked up quite a mileage, especially at weekends, which we normally spent with my maternal grandparents on the far side of the town. My father was not long out of the army. Money was tight, and to save on tram fares, he and my mother set off each Friday evening, pushing me in the pram all the way to the town centre, right through it, and out on the other side. 6 miles they must have trudged, and on Sunday evening 6 miles back. Then father got a new job in the town centre, and to shorten his daily travel time, we moved once again to another terraced house a mile inside the Bolton boundary. It was on Florence Avenue, a quiet side street off the Blackburn Road. Although it was called after a city famous for art and elegance, I knew nothing of this. I thought it took its name from a friend of my mother's called Floribithel. Childhood recall for me begins at Florence Avenue. Memories of clambering on furniture and coming to terms with the sheer hardness of doorknobs, table corners and chair legs. In a minor emergency, my mother had faith in the healing properties of household butter, which she applied so earnestly to the bumps on my skull that it has mildly surprised me not to see it used on casualty. I have another sharp physical memory of a horsehair sofa, which brought close encounters of a different kind. Again I learned not to quote Uncle Eric's opinion that horsehair was a bugger, but it certainly wasn't the least of the troubles experienced by the wearers of short pants. Nowadays, furniture is no longer upholstered in horsehair. On the other hand, small boys seldom seem to wear short pants. Life's a bit of a bugger too, some days. Opposite the Florence Avenue house, there were no buildings at all, just a large open space devoted entirely to allotments. This was pleasant enough for my parents, but of little interest to me. I related far more readily to our back street. Here, for the first time, I made contact with other children of preschool age, and for the next 2 years, my life was illuminated by the company of Norma Nuttall. Those 2 summers must have been fine and hot, because our main activity was popping the tar bubbles that welled up between the cobbles. That and the building of mud pies. We pottered happily to and fro between the gutter and the scullery tap, carrying water in a jam jar to obtain the best consistency, which a couple of bolder, lazier boys achieved by uninhibitedly peeing on it. My one and only attempt at their street wisdom had to be rudely nipped in the bud when my mother appeared and caught me in full spate. The only cloud on our horizon was Big John Siddall, whose arrival on the scene always caused Norma to pull me by the arm towards her back gate. "Let's go in," she would whisper. "He's coming." As one back gate after another was shut against him, Big John exacted a terrible revenge. In moments, there wasn't one mud pie left standing in the street. I came back home one day in tears because John had snatched my white Panama sun hat from my head and filled it to the brim with sloppy mud. That Panama was to go on holiday with me the following week, and so my mother's vexation led her to confront John and his massive ma with the evidence. She didn't bat an eyelid. "Dear, dear," she told us. "Well, boys will be boys." Game, set and match. My mother had to settle down to a laborious cleaning job. On balance, we were fortunate Big John used mud. But, John apart, the days were tranquil, and as Norma and I pursued our quiet ways, we little knew that my parents were contemplating yet another move. We got on with our important construction work, interrupted only by Big John and the equally disruptive cry of "Coal!" Just as John gave warning of his approach by the clumping of his boots, so the coalman's cry would scatter us children and bring our mothers running out to rescue their washing from the clotheslines strung across the street. The women's fingers flew as they juggled with the pegs, but the coalman's horse was leisurely in approach, and Norma and I watched as it ambled between selected gates, stopping and restarting. We were thrilled by its ripe but alien aroma, and intrigued by the nosebag from which it sometimes guzzled as it moved. It was a brilliant idea. If the system could only be extended to small boys, I could be spared the boring periods wasted over meals. I could linger all the waking day in our back street. There is a rhyme which says, "I know 2 things about the horse, and one of them is rather coarse." In actual fact, Both of them are dreadfully coarse, but riveting from the 3-year-old point of view. One of the two usually activated my father in his capacity as allotment holder into running out with a shovel. He explained that what he was about to collect was for putting on his rhubarb, which left me as confused as the lady who exclaimed, "Good gracious, I always put custard on mine." It was disappointing to come upon the other aspect of a horse's coarseness in the company of my mother, who always hurried me past it at such speed that all the details blurred. But if Norma and I were lucky enough to catch it, whilst playing in the street, we had time to appreciate its proportions and its ingenuity. Presumably, after such demonstrations, Norma and I resumed our preoccupation with those other basics: tar, water, and mud. The capacity of young children for wide-eyed wonder is a shining thing. Equally impressive is their appetite for well-rehearsed routine. That hot summer came to an end, and so did our time at Florence Avenue. We moved house once more, and on this occasion I wept salt tears. My separation from Norma seemed as final as divorce. In hard fact, we had moved only a quarter of a mile at most to our new semi-detached. But I was only 4, and it seemed an unbridgeable distance to the clotheslines, the mud pies, and the tar. The other factor was my mother's new determination to supervise me more closely, and to preserve me from influences which might be colourful but were not guaranteeably nice. Here, at Ashworth Lane, I was not to venture beyond the front gate. That was the only gate we had. The garden at the rear of the house was a novelty, but the fence at the bottom merely divided it from somebody else's. It was just a spacious playpen. There was no back street at all. There were few children of my age around. The 2 next door but one were friendly, but they were older and already went to school. Sometimes when they came home they took me in with them to play, but it turned out to be one-way traffic. They had red hair and went to a school called Holy Infants. All the same, I was never too put out in the long term by the prospect of my own company. My mother's idea of a change from solitude was to take me with her on her weekly shopping expedition to the market hall. To absorb the colours and smells of all that fruit and veg under one roof was something indeed. But the best bit, for me, was the journey there and back, because, on the rebound from Norma Nuttall, I was embarking on a shameless flirtation with the British tram. The driver evidently wielded enormous power. For a start, he only moved his arms a couple of inches, and the great juggernaut moved. But it wasn't easy to relate to him, since he was shut away in his own sealed compartment. Besides, you only got to see him from the rear. He never spoke, and it was impossible to imagine him sitting down, ever. But it was not at all difficult to relate to the conductor, especially when he said to me personally, "Now then, young man, aren't sure I ain't paid twice?" It disappointed me when he disappeared at times, upstairs, into a privileged area not available to me. But below, on my level, he was king. And whatever identity I thought I had, he awarded me an extra one. He told me it categorically I was a half. This was quite exclusive because when the tram filled up, it ensured that I was the only one to be lifted up off that rock-hard seat and settled into the comfort of my mother's lap. Halves were special. That Christmas, I became the delirious owner of a tram conductor's outfit, with which I at once began to harass relatives, neighbours over the fence, visitors, tradesmen, and even strangers who walked past our gate. My mother chased after the kindlier ones to give them their money back. At the height of the affair, I refused to remove the outfit at bedtime. When my mother came back later to tuck me up after I'd gone to sleep, if she chanced to kick the chamber pot under the bed, I would sit bolt upright, with my eyes still closed, and say, "Ting, ting!" My mother admitted that she even took the odd visitor upstairs for a demonstration and kicked the pot deliberately. To help pay for the larger mortgage, my father had begun to do extra work on alternate evenings in the neighbouring town of Horwich. Whenever he returned, he would come up to my room, lean over me in the dark and say, Would you like to have a forage? At this point, child welfare officers may relax. He was simply using an ex-army man's word for an exploratory search. In this case, in the top pocket of his overcoat, the prize, which never varied nor ever lost its thrill, was 4 used Bolton Corporation tram tickets. 2 of them blue, 2 yellow. On such nights I stayed awake in eager readiness for that moment when my father pushed open my bedroom door and bent over towards me, his coat, hands and hair still rank from the tobacco smoke of the upper deck, and offered me my tickets to ride. To Horwich, halfway to the moon. Such passion was bound to burn itself out, but the vacuum which it left was destined to be filled. For my birthday, one of my aunts had given me a tiny, very basic gramophone. Just a wind-up job, with half a dozen cheap records thrown in. There weren't nursery stuff, though, because the music industry had still to acknowledge the existence of the very young. My records included an item by a comedy duo called John Henry and Blossom. It was based on matrimonial cut and thrust, and scarcely suitable listening for preschool age. Yet I played it over and over, till I could repeat every line of the dialogue, both parts, word perfect. My parents were becoming concerned by my compulsion to perform. Each of them came from a long line of non-performers, and any thoughts of straying beyond the family genes was uncomfortable. I wasn't just a show-off. I was a one-off. And then, after all, they remembered that my Uncle Ron used to have a fine baritone voice. He could have turned professional any time, if only Auntie Bessie had let him. I was admitted back into the fold. As my 5th birthday approached, people took to mentioning that I would soon be starting school, but I wasn't apprehensive. After all, I'd already learned to read and write a little, and I was eagerly looking forward to seeing Norma Nuttall again, while firmly pushing the thought of Big John to the back of my mind. I was certainly less anxious than my mother, who knew that I would have to emerge from semi-detachment and mix once more with the children who did not have niceness among their major goals in life. In September 1926, I was taken by the hand and led half a mile down Ashworth Lane to the little village school at Bank Top, where the official learning process was to begin. It was a single-storey building of the usual blackened stone, in which 4 classes of around 20 apiece were taught by women, whose faces and manner I can still remember. But although I can still see the various classrooms, I have little memory of what went on in them in the name of education. During my remaining time at Ashworth Lane, school was rather eclipsed by a couple of things which occurred elsewhere. The first was the birth of my sister, Jean, an event which found me totally unprepared. A great acceptor like me had no difficulty in swallowing all that malarkey about the stork or the gooseberry bush. But I didn't see why my mother needed to stay in bed so long. My father, when tackled on the subject, said he didn't know much about it really, but supposed it was probably the shock. Now, that I did find difficult to accept. My new little sister was magic. The other thing happened while we were out for a walk one Saturday afternoon. Mother and I were pushing Jean in her pram up Burtonshaw Brow, when I left them to find out what was at the top of a steep, grassy slope to our right. Halfway up, I must have disturbed a wasp's nest, and in a second they were upon me. The air seemed black with them, and the noise was very frightening. I cried out and ran back down the slope, but fell and rolled down to the path in a heap, being stung quite a bit on the way. My mother stood aghast for a moment, but finally swung into action with her umbrella. When her combination of brolly, fear and short-sightedness had almost reduced me to insensibility, she amazed me by yelling, "Now run home and tell your dad." When I did at last arrive, my father was not over glad to be interrupted. He was busy tinkering with an odd sort of box with wires. It was to be our first radio set. He was torn for a moment or two between medication for me or Marconi for himself. But duty prevailed. He steeped me in a hot bath, dried me gently, and then anointed me all over with Edge's Dolly Blue. In the mirror, I saw the reflection of a diminutive ancient Briton, was gazing at myself in fascination when my father drew my attention to the water in the bath. There on the surface floated the bodies of a dozen wasps. "My mum did that," I told him with satisfaction. "Not really," he said. "There's some very strong stuff in the Dolly Blue called ammonia. That's what fettles them. Besides," he added comfortably, "your mum couldn't knock the skin off a rice pudding."
All music and studio recording by Robert Burgess. And this was an Old Dolly production.